The original Snow Queen story by Hans Christian Andersen was about the loss and regaining of warmth in summer as a metaphor for the search for the Christ child. So it was a quite explicitly Christian story, a story about the deceptions of the devil and his agents as using snow. In Frozen, it's the opposite, but there is a playing with biblical conventions underlying the narrative. All of the major human characters have biblical names, and not only biblical names, but biblical names which occur in one form or another in the first two chapters of the book of Luke. So all of these biblical equivalent characters are quite closely acquainted with each other. Hannah is the Hebrew version of Anna's name, and quite interesting in that it's Jehovah-based name. The names based on Ea, the Sumerian deity, or Jehovah, are often the names of prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah, and you can tell that there's this Jehovah link by the AH on the end of the name in part. But with Hannah, this is an amazing name because the AH is both forward and backward. It's on the beginning and the end of her name, which is spelled the same way, forward and backward. She's a very important character in the first book of Samuel because she gives birth to the prophet Samuel. So although she has an AH Jehovah-based name, her son has one of the Elohim El-based names, and so does the prophet or the preacher in the priest in the temple, Eli, and her own husband, whose name also starts with El. So she has a divinely conceived, at least in part, child, because at first her womb is closed by Jehovah, and it's open so that she can have Samuel as a child. Later on, she's visited by the Lord, and she has 5 more children, even though it's not mentioned that she has known her husband at that time. So it's certainly possible that these 5 children, and maybe even Samuel himself, are divinely conceived. This carries on in the New Testament with a woman named Elizabeth, another version of the name Elsa, and also containing the name El, Elohim, which occurs so many times in the Bible in the names of prophets, including Ezekiel and Daniel, and in the names of the angels. And once again, we have the child not quite matching the deity in that Elizabeth gives birth to John the Baptist. And Hans is another name, another version of the name John, Johannes, and it is a Jehovah-based name. So in that case, you have an Elohim woman giving birth to a Jehovah-named child. But all of these are associated with the birth of Christ, Christoph in another version. And they are told, the people of Jerusalem are told the significance of this event, how to celebrate it, by a female prophet named Anna. That's the Greek and Latin version of the name Hannah, which is the Hebrew. So all 4 of these are intimately connected with the birth of Christ in the book of Luke, chapters 1 and 2. Despite that, the Frozen story is the antithesis of the biblical story, the exact opposite. A parody, a vicious parody, even, in that the way the characters behave is the exact opposite of Jesus. In the Christ story, you have the killing and rebirth of the son, whereas in the Frozen story, you have the killing with no rebirth of the daughter's parents and the attempted killing of the other daughter. There's also the way that they use their powers, and that they're constantly trying to hide them and keep them to themselves and not let the outside world know that they have them. When these powers do escape, they are shown and manifested in violent ways. They're primarily used in combat or for threatening the life of other people, such as Elsa, who brings out a storm, as opposed to Jesus, who calms the waters and makes the storm go away, and who brings people back from the dead, whereas Elsa summons up a storm that kills her parents and threatens to kill everyone else. Anna also hides her powers, and they're primarily used in things like bending over trees, throwing torches at wolves, moving at berserker accelerated speed so that she can stop Hans's sword, warming herself up after Elsa has frozen her, and so on. So any healing capacity or abundance capacity is pretty much confined to the characters themselves, rather than Jesus, who went out and fed massive numbers of people, healed them of diseases, cast out demons. These characters, particularly Elsa, when she builds the tower, seem to be more like they're making pacts with demons. There's a tendency for them to engage in alchemical behaviors. One of these is called the alchemical marriage, where in the final stage of the alchemy, you bring the two opposing elements together to make a new one. And this is inherent in the earliest lyrics in the movie, where you talk about something being born of these opposing elements, cold winter air, mountain rain, coming together for the expression of Elsa's powers. And as I've discussed before, both Elsa and Anna can be seen as embodying alchemical and astrological principles, 2 seasons each and 2 elements each, such as earth and fire in the case of Anna, and the opposing ones for Elsa. This means that there's a lot of marrying and bringing together, the idea of marrying up, even though these 2 women would already seem to have, as I've said in another video, everything you could possibly think of and no reason for marrying up, because they have nothing apparently further to gain. This is a popularization of royalty and the idea of royalty and wanting to be born into something rather than working for it and having it at someone else's expense, which is popularized by the movie and the popularization of particularly Elsa as a name for young girls and a role model for them, unfortunately. And part of the overall ideology of elites in general is the idea of stealing things from other people, working your way up the cosmic ladder, up the cosmic pyramid scheme by taking things from others, rather than the story of Jesus, who passed on and taught other people how to gain his abilities, and according to one passage in the book of John, even eventually being able to surpass his abilities. There is also there's a pronounced tendency toward royalty. These are not just common names, so that when you use them in the movie, they think, oh, those are just everyday names, and particularly in Scandinavia. They don't mean anything because they're so common, but they are not just associated with spiritual alchemy, marrying the gods, having children by the gods, but they're also common in royalty. John was the King of England. Elizabeth, the Elsa-related name, was the most common name of queens of England and of the most prominent ones in the last few centuries. Olaf was a king of Norway multiple times and the patron saint of Norway. Sven, in another form, another spelling, was quite common as a name for Danish and neighboring, like Norwegian English kings. So all of these are royal and about the idea of being born into something. And they're also, they're about this promotion of this specific ideology, but they have not the same attitude that you see in things like Norwegian death metal. It's not about saying Christianity was imposed on Scandinavia, therefore we want to get rid of it and get back to our old religion. Because there are trolls in the story, and what trolls do is be irreverent and disrespectful to traditional religion, including Norse religion. So it is in a way both anti-Norse, because the original Gerda name from the Snow Queen story is completely taken out altogether. So the main character is no longer named a traditional Norse name. But the people who have the Norse names are objects of fun. They're the comic relief, and the ones who have jokes played on them or look silly the most, such as Olaf and Sven. And they are almost attempted to be replaced by the trolls' Machiavellian machinations behind the scenes, and where there's a sense of religion being wiped out, but it's not Christian religion being wiped out to revert to Norse religion because of the prominence of the trolls in the story. They're attacking even the Norse religion in a way, because I don't think the Norse characters are portrayed in the most flattering way either. So you have the loss of the main Norse character's name, and these slightly altered versions of names from the Bible. But they are not done in a way to promote the Christian message as in the Bible, or even in the original Hans Christian Andersen story. It's about this climbing of the ladder, and in some ways it has some things in common with other marry your way up stories like Twilight and 50 Shades of Grey, in which the primary character is called Christian, but that's based, of course, on a vampire story. So yeah, a vampire, like in Nosferatu, comes to shore in the middle of a storm. It brings death and destruction with him, much like Elsa does when she says, let it go, I'm not following anybody's rules anymore. So there's this link that there's a lot of non-Christian, or at least by some people's standards, non-Christian elements introduced in the story. In fact, elements that are about as far away from Christianity as you can possibly get. And it's done in such a covert way that it's done to maximize profit, in that you don't want to be too obvious that you're basing your story on Christian ideas on the one hand, but then they're slipping this other ideology in on the other, doing the exact opposite of the Christian story in many ways. So that's something I thought people should think about. And the Norse names that are given are all male, given to non-humans, whereas in the original story, the main Norse character, Gerda, was female and human. So there are an awful lot of reversals, which I don't see talked about. I saw one article that was about all the names in Frozen, and it said that they were biblical, but then it didn't mention Kristoff. Like, how do you mention that all these names are biblical and then not mention Christ when you're talking about at least Jewish and eventually Christian sources? And that is a huge omission, I would think, when you're talking about something that's so fundamental to looking at the story. And when I see people's commentaries, they try to say, this is kind of a Christian movie. Well, yeah, it uses a few Christian elements, but for the most part, it's, as far as I can see, for the purpose of inverting them.